Hello and thanks for tuning in to the Liberty Report. I'm Daniel McAdams, your host today. Dr. Paul, who's normally in this seat, is traveling this week. He'll be back soon, however, to resume our normal broadcasts. Those tuning in to perhaps hear us opine about the Kavanaugh hearings will be disappointed because we are officially a safe space from those who are not as interested in watching the circus unfold in Washington. So we're going to talk about something a little bit different. It's something we've talked about a bit in the past that we need to talk about again, and that's the ongoing war in Yemen and the U.S. participation in that war. And there are some new developments that I think we should go over a little bit, but you know, the point about Yemen simply is that a genocide is going on by all definitions of the word. The Saudi United Arab Emirates coalition, which is backed by the U.S., not only in assistance with refueling, but in targeting, in sales of weapons that are used to kill Yemeni people. This really meets a lot of the definitions. But when you think about genocide, when you hear the word thrown around, interestingly enough, it's seldom used to end intervention. It's most often used to introduce, to begin an intervention. So we hear about all of the cruelties of, for example, Saddam Hussein. We hear about the cruelties of Gaddafi. Before that, we heard about there's a genocide in Bosnia, there's a genocide in Rwanda, etc. Always the outcome when people claim this are that we've got to do something, we've got to intervene. Well, in the case with Yemen, the solution would be a lot simpler. I think the accusations of genocide are accurate. The solution is to stop doing something, to stop intervening. The question is, how can that be done? So we know that the Saudis and the UAE, with U.S. help, started attacking Yemen back in 2015. That's 3 years of bombing and attacks. And it's because simply a faction in Yemen overthrew a leader that had been put in with Saudi support during the so-called Arab Spring. The faction in Yemen, the Houthis, didn't want this guy to be the president, so they overthrew him. May not be the constitutional way of doing things, you know, in our perspective. May not be something that we like watching, but the relevance to what happened in Yemen, the overthrowing of the president, to the United States, to our foreign policy, to our national interest is zero. So it had nothing to do with us. Essentially a Saudi and UAE proxy war against Iran. But, of course, we got involved because we're tied to the hip with the Saudis. You know, the numbers on the war, you've heard them. They're horrible. They're disgusting. They're getting even worse. Just reading a report, civilian deaths since June in Yemen are up 164%. Millions are facing starvation. There were 2 high-profile bombings of civilians over the last couple of months, which helped to put together U.S. support for ending this, although it's nowhere near where it should be. August 7th, a school bus was bombed by the Saudis. A Lockheed Martin bomb was found on the site. So our military-industrial complex participating. 51 people were killed, 51 civilians, among them 40 children. 40 children were blown up. So 130 kids die every day in Yemen, according to Save the Children. They die from starvation. They die from cholera. They die of a number of things. They die of being bombed while they're taking a school bus to school. And all this, of course, has the fingerprints of the U.S. active participation in it. And so the question is, people in Congress, are they interested in a U.S. war? Hasn't been declared, hasn't been authorized. Are they going to do something? Well, they tried last year, and this is under the War Powers Act, the War Powers Resolution that became law after the Vietnam War, provides for Congress to introduce a privileged motion, a privileged concurrent resolution that demands the president remove U.S. forces from conflict if it hasn't been expressly authorized or declared as a war by Congress. They tried to do it last year and it didn't work. There was a bargain that resulted in essentially a toothless resolution being passed. But something that did happen was the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019, which passed in August. And that requires the Trump administration to certify that the Saudis and United Arab Emirates are doing everything they can to minimize civilian casualties in their ongoing war in Yemen. So the State Department has to certify that they were doing everything they could to minimize civilian casualties. In the wake of that, Secretary Mattis, the Defense Secretary, said, our support for the Saudis it's not a blank check. It really depends on whether or not they're able to get their act together and stop killing so many civilians, or at least certify. So this sort of came to a head last month or a couple of weeks ago, where Secretary Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was required to certify, hey, are they doing all they can to stop killing civilians or not? Well, we find out from an explosive Wall Street Journal investigative piece that when it came time for him to certify, and we have the graphic here, the headline, he just simply lied. He overruled his staff, who said they're basically doing nothing to stem the murder of civilians in Yemen. And the reason why, because there were $2 billion in weapons sales that were in play. And if the U.S. were to stop refueling Saudi planes as they bombed school buses in Yemen, the Saudis may not be that interested in buying any more weapons if they can't refuel while they're dropping them on Saudi civilians. So Pompeo decided to listen to the people who told him, no big deal, just falsify it. So this is what happened, and it's very cynical. It tells a lot about how the military-industrial complex works. It tells about what happens about how neocons work, and Pompeo certainly is a neoconservative in every aspect. So, but don't worry, there's plenty of hypocrisy to go around. We can beat on Pompeo, and he lied, and he should be called to task. He lied to Congress. But we have a tweet that's an interesting exchange between Samantha Power, who was a Nikki Haley in a previous existence under Obama, and here she's crying crocodile tears over Yemen. She talks about how, she says, a similar effort in the Senate this year came close to passing. There has only been more horrific, pointless bloodshed since in Yemen. We in the Obama administration should have cut off aid. Trump shows no concern for loss of life, but Congress can act. Okay, a lot of that's right, but here's what Glenn Greenwald said, and he makes a very good point. He says, amoral, craven people defend or remain silent about heinous policies when they're in power in order to cling to power. They only find the courage to denounce it when they're out of power, when doing so has no effect but to salvage their reputation. Very, very good point, and that is how it works. They did nothing to try to stop the slaughter in Yemen while they were in power, and now they cry crocodile tears over the situation in Yemen that they're out of power. So there's Samantha Power for you, a person who was a devotee of humanitarian interventionism. It's left countless thousands of people dead. But there's a new House concurrent resolution under the rules that I had outlined in the War Powers Resolution, where members of Congress can bring up these resolutions demanding, and they must get a vote on the floor within 3 days. And Dr. Paul did this many times with, for example, Representative Kucinich. They would introduce bipartisan resolutions to get the U.S. out of different conflicts, Iraq primarily among those in the mid-2000s. So this is a tool. This is probably one of the few advantages provided by the War Powers Resolution to Congress to force a vote to the floor. And what it does is it simply says that that not only will U.S. troops not be allowed to participate, and we do know that there are special forces fighting in Yemen. We know that the U.S. is actively participating. Not only will that end, but they will have to end coordination, and that's a key term because essentially what the claim is, and this is what Secretary Mattis claims, is that the U.S. is helping with targeting. Our targeting assistance is helping them avoid civilian casualties. Well, if that's the case, then our targeting assistance probably needs to be worked on a little bit because, as we mentioned earlier, civilian casualties are up in a radical way. Will it work? Is it a solution to bringing the U.S. out of this horrible, shameful partnership with the Saudis in slaughtering Yemenis? I think it's doubtful, because I think it's sort of an artful term, an artful process that doesn't necessarily remove the United States from being involved in the Yemen conflict. I think certainly a far more effective means. I will back up and say, however, it is a useful tool, and Dr. Paul and Representative Kucinich used it a lot because it starts the debate. So in that perspective, from that sense, it is helpful because it does begin a debate. It forces members to go to the floor and cast a vote. So it has a rhetorical use. It has a use in informing people. It has a use in bringing it to the radar screen of people who just aren't thinking about it very much. So in that sense, it is useful. But as a legal tool to end the U.S. participation in the war, I am slightly more skeptical about it. Far better way to approach that would be to simply prohibit any funds from being spent in aiding the Saudi-UAE alliance in its war on Yemen. So that would be, I think, a much more effective. As we mentioned, the objections that Matt has had about they'll kill more civilians if we're not helping them with targeting, I think are a bit spurious. I wouldn't put too much emphasis on those, because they're already killing many, and many more face death from starvation and cholera, as we mentioned. So what is the war in Yemen really about, and why are people like Pompeo and Bolton, why are they so obsessed with it? How is it in any way important to the U.S., to our national security, to our objectives? Well, the fact is it's not. It is important in only one sense, which is that the war in Yemen is really a proxy war. As I mentioned earlier, it really is about Iran. It's about the United States being in place, fighting a war. Ironically, the Houthis, who are said to be backed by Iran, and that's very limited if they are at all backed by Iran. Iran is not killing civilians in Yemen. It's only the U.S. trying to save the Yemenis that's resulting in civilians being killed. So this is about Iran. This is about the Saudis and United Arab Emirates fighting against Iranian influence in the region, which ironically increases with each U.S. interventionism. As we've talked about many times on this show, the U.S. attack on Iraq certainly resulted in Iran being a much bigger player, an important player in the region, to the point where now Nikki Haley is complaining about, oh, the Iranians have so much influence in Iraq. Well, maybe you should have thought about that, neocons, when you were pushing this stupid war. And Iran, of course, has a lot more influence in Syria now because of the war that was sparked by outside influence, primarily by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and the United States and Israel and others, which has also given Iran much more influence in Syria. So with every intervention, there is increasing Iranian influence. And what is the solution in the minds of the neocons? Well, more intervention is the solution. So that's why we have the ongoing war in Yemen, and that's why we have a big shift in policy in Syria, where the U.S. has 2,000 service member stations at Al-Tanf in eastern Syria. And now we hear John Bolton saying that it's not really about ISIS anymore. We're going to stay illegally, he didn't say the word, but it's true, illegally in Syria as long as Iran is in Syria. And of course, Iran is legally in Syria because it's an ally of the Syrian government. They were asked to come in and help. So this is an ongoing war. This is a neocon war against Iran. They have had this in their sights for the longest time. They're not willing to give it up. And if a few thousand Yemenis have to die so that they can pursue their absurd, bloody vision for the Middle East, it doesn't bother them. It doesn't bother the neoconservatives. You know, you have to break a few eggs, is their way to look at it. And that's certainly the case. They broke 1 million eggs in Iraq, and the place is far worse off than it has been. So they're panting for war. The president, unfortunately, is surrounded by this toxin called neoconservatism. He seems to be absolutely incapable of extricating himself from their horrible decisions, their idiotic ideas, their murderous instincts. If he's not one of them, he's certainly not doing a good job separating them from his administration. In all senses, they're, in fact, in charge of his foreign policy, unfortunately. So what is the solution? Non-interventionism. We say it over and over as a mantra, but it really is the case. If you don't like Iranian influence in the region, well, you shouldn't have gotten involved. We We shouldn't have been trying to overthrow countries. What can we do now? We can simply, as Dr. Paul says, just march home. Simply get out of Syria. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are on the ropes there. No real thanks to us. We're not supposed to be there. Get out of Yemen. Stop backing the Saudis. Stop giving them targeting information. Stop giving them Lockheed Martin missiles. And make it very clear to them that you will not have U.S. support in this ongoing war. Force the parties to some sort of negotiation in some way, perhaps under the UN auspices. But whatever the case, for us to pull out at least would give us a little bit more moral authority. So the answer, the solution, the pro-peace solution is non-interventionism. Don't get involved in the affairs of others. Don't try to remake the world in your own image. Leave the other people alone. Trade, friendship with all who seek the same with us. If we pursued that, as Dr. Paul would say if he were here, we would go a long way toward promoting peace and prosperity. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to the Liberty Report today. Please come back and see us soon.